Hello and welcome to Healthy Seminars. I'm your moderator, Lauren Brown. I practice traditional Chinese medicine in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, called AcuBalance. And we have back Dr. Mark Ratner. He's the Chief Science Officer of Theralogix. A big thank you to Theralogix for sponsoring this educational webinar. Our topic today is insulin resistance, PCOS, insulin resistance and PCOS, the expanding role of the Inositols. And I want to just let you know a little bit about today, a little bit of housekeeping, and also where you can find other things related to Dr. Mark Ratner's talk here. And I just had my own little tech issue. Let's see if I can share this. Here we go. All right, I'm back with that. I want to let you know that on this page here where you see healthyseminars.com/Theralogix, this is where you're going to find the replay to this webinar. This is also where you'll find the link. If you want to get the handouts, you can contact Theralogix and get the handouts. And Dr. Mark Ratner has done two other talks, which have been well received and I think are very informative. So I just want to bring to your attention, they're on this page. The replay is available. My favorite, I haven't watched the third one yet, but I really like this one on micronutrients for viral infections. What Dr. Ratner did just related to virus and COVID, looking at some of the natural supplements out there and looking at the research, so the evidence to support their use for immunity, for viral infections, and even specific some of the stuff to COVID. So if you're interested in that, do check this out. It's available here on the healthyseminars.com Theralogix page. Those handouts also can still be made available to you by contacting Theralogix. And then he also did a talk on cannabinoids, so from chronic pain to COVID-19. And so this was also a really nice informative lecture, and this is available to you, as are the handouts that you can get through Theralogix. I think I shared on the other webinars, it's nice, Dr. Mark Ratner is a medical doctor, and he is the Chief Science Officer at Theralogix. And I love it that he's talked a lot about nutrition and even some supplements in his talks, because he's an MD that has done undergraduate studies and a master's degree program in nutrition. So he's not like an MD that did 2 hours of nutritional training. He has done a lot of extra training to be an expert to speak on this. So again, you can get this at healthyseminars.com Theralogix. The handouts to the webinar, just to show you, if you scroll down, you'll see a little line here, a message from Theralogix. There's extra video and information here, but this is please follow this link to connect with us. If you connect with Theralogix, you can get the handouts for all 3 webinars through them. So this is on the replay page. And also they have a special discount that you can check out as well until the end of the month, July 31st, 2020. If you can bring up the disclaimer team, that would be great as well. During the webinar, please post your questions in the chat room. I will moderate those for Dr. Mark. I want to remind you that this is for educational purposes only. This is not medical advice. This should not be interpreted as medical advice. If you have a health condition, please seek out a qualified healthcare provider. Again, this is for educational purposes only. Mark, let's have you share your PowerPoint and get the show on the road. And again, a big thank you to Theralogix and the team at Theralogix for sponsoring this educational webinar. Mark, thank you for putting this lecture together.
Sure.
And the Theralogix team, thank you also for offering a discount on your products to the viewers that have come to Healthy Seminars today. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Lauren. You guys hearing me okay, right? Good. Okay. So just real quickly, a little bit about kind of my background and why I'm going to be talking to you about PCOS and the Inositols tonight. I, by training, I'm a board-certified urologist. And for most of my career, I worked in male fertility. And I worked with one of the largest IVF practices here in the United States, doing mostly male factor work. But for the past 20 years, I've also been the chief science officer for Theralogix. And as Lauren mentioned, I have this background in nutrition. And so nutritional approaches to fertility and other areas of medical specialization have been of great interest. And so Theralogix, the company that I work with, was started about 18, 19 years ago. And we are currently very involved in the fertility world, both in the United States and Canada. So today what I'm going to talk about is PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and how important insulin resistance is in understanding PCOS, and the role that a special type of compound called inositols can play in the treatment of PCOS. And so we'll start with a quick review or like an overview of PCOS. And I realize that a lot of you are probably pretty familiar with PCOS. And so I won't spend too much time or give you too much detail here. But the bottom line is we'll do a quick overview. Then we'll talk about the role that insulin plays in PCOS and why inositols play an important role in the action of insulin. We'll then look at clinical trials that have been published over the past 10 years looking at the benefits that inositols can offer. And we'll look at some treatment considerations from a practical perspective. How does one go about using inositols with patients that have PCOS? So PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, it actually affects 5 to 10% of all reproductive age women. It is relatively common. And it's considered the most common cause of female infertility, but really you have to qualify that. It's the most common cause in women under the age of, say, 37, 38, because once women get beyond that age, then you start getting into egg issues and egg aneuploidy, which is becoming, at that point, a bigger cause of infertility. And so what we really should say is that it's probably the most common cause of ovulatory infertility in women. And there are really 3 diagnostic features which are most characteristic of PCOS. The first is infrequent or absent ovulation. And obviously what this means from the patient's perspective is that she's not getting her period on a regular basis. Sometimes it might be 6 or 12 months without a period, or it could be very, very irregular. The second diagnostic feature that's pretty typical is clinical or biochemical evidence of increased testosterone, which medically speaking, we call that hyperandrogenemia. And hyperandrogenemia is essentially going to be manifested in a way that's very apparent to the patient. A lot of the issues there have to do with hair. Either you start losing hair where you don't want to lose hair, where you want to keep your hair. Women can get male pattern baldness from having excess testosterone, or it can be the opposite problem. You can have what we call hirsutism, meaning you get excess body hair on the face or on the extremities. And so body hair issues and skin issues, including acne, are both signs of excess testosterone in women with PCOS. The third characteristic feature is polycystic ovaries on ultrasound. And so this is an image of an ovary, and those dark spots on the image, those are follicles. Those are the little pockets or follicles. Sometimes they'll be called cysts. But every month, under normal circumstances, several of them form, and the egg that's going to be ovulated forms in one of those. But in a PCOS ovary, there are going to be too many of these follicles. Typically, you want to see more than 12, and they have to be of a certain size. And so when you see this appearance on a ovarian ultrasound, you start to think this is a polycystic ovary. And so how do we make the diagnosis? Well, believe it or not, there's still a lot of disagreement about that question. Back when I was in medical school, a few years back, this was called Stein-Leventhal syndrome. It was named by the 2 gynecologists who first described it. And then about 25, 30 years ago, they kind of did away with that name and they started calling it polycystic ovary syndrome or polycystic ovarian syndrome. And everybody kind of had a sense of what some of the characteristics were, but they then started to make an effort to try and really standardize the way that this would be diagnosed. And so a conference was held in 1990, 30 years ago, at the NIH, and they came up with what they call the classic PCOS criteria, which is hyperandrogenism, meaning excess testosterone, and chronic anovulation. And for a number of years, those were the two things that you had to have in order to assign a diagnosis of PCOS. But then there was a conference held 13 years later in Europe, in Rotterdam, and there was a consensus at this conference that there were multiple ways that you could make this diagnosis. And so we ended up with what we're now going to be called the Rotterdam criteria, which said that you could have any two of the three following characteristics and make the diagnosis if you had two of the three. So excess testosterone, anovulation, or PCOM, which means polycystic ovarian morphology, meaning seeing those cysts on the ultrasound. And then finally, several years later, the Androgen Excess Society decided, nope, you couldn't possibly make a diagnosis of PCOS without excess testosterone. The Rotterdam criteria said, well, you could have just anovulation and lots of cysts on the ovary, and that woman would have a diagnosis of PCOS. But what the Androgen Excess Society said is, no, you absolutely have to have excess testosterone and then some sign of ovulatory dysfunction, of ovarian dysfunction, either anovulation, meaning you're missing those periods, or abnormal ultrasound. So the Androgen Excess Society, which is the most recent set of diagnostic criteria, requires the presence of excess testosterone. And so this is still in flux. And so whenever you talk to somebody about PCOS, that's a researcher or looking at a clinical trial, one of the questions you ask is, what criteria did you use when you did the study? But question then becomes, what is the clinical impact for the patient? And the clinical impact of PCOS can really be broken down into two big categories. The reproductive impact, okay, which is essentially going to be infertility, right? When you're not getting your period regularly or you go 6 or 8 months without a period, getting pregnant becomes near impossible. The other thing that we do know is that PCOS has an adverse impact on the quality of the eggs that are produced. And so there are reproductive impacts that are significant, but then we also have what we would call the metabolic impact of PCOS. And the primary metabolic impact for most women is obesity. And 70 to 80% of PCOS patients actually have an elevated BMI. Dermatologic and hair issues, we mentioned these a moment ago, due to the excess testosterone. And then women with PCOS have an increased risk of a number of more serious other conditions: type 2 diabetes, gestational diabetes during pregnancy, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, sleep apnea. There's a number of other conditions which PCOS predisposes women to have. So why do women seek assistance? Why do women present to a provider with an issue? It can either be for metabolic reasons or it can be for reproductive reasons. You know, obviously teenagers, adolescents who come in to see their family doctor, they may just be having issues with skin and hair and weight control. And oh, by the way, they're not getting their period very regularly, but they're not really interested in pregnancy at that point. So it's not a fertility question, it's more a metabolic question. And so patients seek assistance for either metabolic or reproductive issues, and sometimes both. So what are the standard approaches? If a woman goes in to see her OBGYN, and she says, you know, we're trying to get pregnant, but my periods are coming so irregularly, it's almost impossible for us to time things. One of the first things that the OBGYN might do is try to force the woman's ovaries to produce eggs using what we call ovulation induction. And the initial approach is typically going to be with an oral medication, either Clomid, which is the trade name for clomiphene, or letrozole. And they'll put the woman on these medications, and we'll talk more about them in a moment, but and then encourage them to have sex once she's starting to get her period more regularly. If intercourse does not achieve a pregnancy, they might move on to intrauterine insemination. And if 2 or 3 cycles of IUI doesn't do the trick, then they'll probably suggest in vitro fertilization, IVF or IVF-ICSI. For women who come in and their primary issues are metabolic, the clinician who is taking a holistic and comprehensive approach is going to speak to the patient about diet and exercise and weight loss, because all of these metabolic issues that occur in women with PCOS will respond significantly to weight loss. And so there are PCOS diets that are out there and available online, and certainly exercise is an important factor as well. The most common oral medication that's probably used strictly for metabolic issues is oral contraceptives. The estrogen essentially will counteract the effects of the testosterone. It also increases sex hormone binding globulin. And so you'll start to see a reduced effect from the excess androgens in the bloodstream. But for women that don't respond that well to those measures, the most common medication used then is an insulin sensitizer called metformin. Metformin has been used for PCOS for probably a good 20 or 25 years because it is an insulin sensitizer. And to understand why that works, we need to understand the role of insulin in the pathophysiology of PCOS. It turns out that insulin resistance plays a very important role in creating the issues that we see in PCOS. And so let's understand insulin. This may be a little bit basic for a lot of you, but we'll go through it quickly. Insulin obviously is a hormone, and it allows our cells to take in sugar from the bloodstream, glucose from the bloodstream. And then once that glucose is in the cell, it's either burned for energy or it can be stored as glycogen for later use. Insulin is produced by the pancreas, which is an organ that's found right behind the stomach. And what happens when the level of glucose, of blood sugar, rises after a meal, the pancreas will release insulin into the blood. So here's a nice little schematic that sort of demonstrates exactly how that process unfolds. So we've got the bloodstream up and to the left, and then a cell. And there is a receptor on the cell membrane, which is called an insulin receptor. And also on the cell membrane are what we call glucose transporter proteins. And these are proteins that actually, once they get the proper signal from the insulin receptor, these proteins allow glucose to come into the cell from the bloodstream. So after a meal, we start to see glucose levels in the blood go up. Now, under normal circumstances, the next step is the pancreas releases insulin. And the insulin binds to the insulin receptor, activates it, and then the insulin receptor releases what we call second messengers. And those second messengers go into the cell. They then allow glucose to come in via the glucose transporter proteins, and the glucose is either going to be burned for energy or converted to glycogen. Now, the reason why this process is important to understand is because those second messengers are formed from inositols. And so that brings us to the subject of the two main inositols, which are important in the action of insulin. And so we need to turn a little bit now to the basic science behind inositols. Inositols are sugar alcohols. They're made of 6 carbons in a ring, And it's the same family as compounds that we've heard of, like sorbitol and mannitol. We get inositols in fruits and beans in our diet. Typical North American diet would have 800 to 1,000 milligrams of inositols per day. So this isn't some exotic chemical. It's not something that's found rarely in some special plant. Inositols are in many, many different foods that we eat. But it turns out that there are actually 9 different isomers, 9 different inositols, and 2 of them are really important because they serve as those second messengers for the insulin receptor. So there are the 9. This is not going to be on the midterm, don't worry. And if we look at the 2 that are most important, myoinositol and D-chiroinositol, they are important because those 2 both serve as second messengers for the insulin receptor. So myoinositol is by far the most common form. It's the form that's found in our food. And 99% of the inositol in our tissues is myoinositol. And it works as the second messenger not only for insulin, but also for FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, in the ovary. So myoinositol has a very important role in hormone signaling. The other inositol, D-chiroinositol, is only 1% of the inositols in our tissues. And we get the D-chiroinositol that we need by converting myoinositol into D-chiro. And that conversion, myo into D-chiro, is done by an insulin-dependent enzyme called an epimerase enzyme. Now, when we say it's insulin dependent, what that means is the presence of insulin drives that conversion of myo to D-chiro. And it turns out that D-chiro, whereas myo is very important in the ovary, D-chiroinositol is very important for insulin's action in peripheral tissues. So we've got these 2 different isomers, myoinositol and D-chiroinositol. And, an isomer means it's got the same chemical formula. And if you look at these 2 different diagrams here, the only difference is here the hydroxyl group is pointing north, and here the hydroxyl group is pointing south. So myoinositol, again, 99% of the inositol in human tissues. It is the second messenger for the insulin receptor, and it's also a critical intermediary and a second messenger for the FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, as well. D-chiroinositol, only 1% of the inositol in our tissues is D-chiro, but it's also a second messenger for the insulin receptor, primarily working in peripheral tissues. And this is the most interesting part. It's now been discovered that D-chiroinositol has an adverse effect in the ovary in that it stimulates testosterone production. And we're going to show how that happens in just a minute. The conversion of myoinositol into D-chiroinositol is by this enzyme called the epimerase enzyme. And an epimerase is just an enzyme that converts one stereoisomer into another. In this case, the inositol epimerase converts myo into D-chiro, and that epimerase enzyme is stimulated into action by the presence of insulin. All right. It turns out that the balance, the ratio between myoinositol and D-chiroinositol in different tissues is important. And the ratio is supposed to be a little bit different in the peripheral tissue than it is in the ovary. And that ratio determines how the tissue responds or doesn't respond to insulin. And so if the ratio between myo and D-chiro gets out of whack, the action of insulin starts to become abnormal. And so that abnormality is what we call insulin resistance. And most PCOS patients have insulin resistance. So let's go back to this little schematic here. Again, this is that point right after a meal where you've got the glucose molecules in the bloodstream, and the pancreas has released insulin, so you've got insulin in the bloodstream as well. This is the normal situation. Again, the insulin binds to the insulin receptor. The insulin receptor releases the second messengers, which can either be myoinositol-based or dechirioinositol-based, and the ratio between the two is important. When the ratio is proper, it allows the glucose to come in the cell, where it's either burned for energy or converted to glycogen. Okay, what can go wrong? How can that not happen properly? So let's go back again to that point. After a meal, under normal circumstances, you got the glucose in the blood and you've got the insulin that's been released. But occasionally, you're going to have a situation where the pancreas doesn't work properly and there is no insulin released. And so no insulin to bind to the insulin receptor. The glucose cannot get into the cell, and the glucose starts to build up in the bloodstream. So this is what we call hyperglycemia. And this is what we see in type 1 diabetes, essentially pancreatic failure to make insulin. The other thing that can go wrong, though, and again, go back to that point right after a meal, you've got, let's say, a normal pancreas, okay? And you've got glucose in the blood. A meal has just been eaten, and the pancreas has released insulin. And the insulin binds to the insulin receptor. And the insulin receptor, though, releases an abnormal ratio of second messengers. So in this particular illustration, the amount of dechirioinositol second messenger is way more than it's supposed to be. And the myoinositol is way less. So the ratio is all out of whack, and the glucose can't get into the cell. What happens? You get a buildup of glucose again in the bloodstream. So you get that same hyperglycemia, but in this situation, the pancreas is normal. And as the blood glucose goes up and up and up, the pancreas says, oh, we need more insulin. And it releases lots more insulin. And so you get a combination of hyperglycemia, excess blood glucose, and hyperinsulinemia. So you get excess levels of insulin in the bloodstream when you've got insulin resistance. And this is what we see in insulin resistance, and this is what we see in PCOS and in type 2 diabetes and gestational diabetes. Insulin resistance is the underlying pathophysiology for most of those conditions. So most PCOS patients do have insulin resistance. Patients who have a high BMI, it's as high as 70 to 80%, but there is a subset of PCOS patients that we call lean PCOS patients, and those patients have a lower risk of having insulin resistance, probably 30 to 40%. And in PCOS patients, we're going to show this in a second, insulin resistance occurs in the peripheral tissues. And by peripheral tissues, we mean muscle, liver, fat, but not so much in the ovary. And that fact that is happening in the periphery, but not in the ovary, leads to something that we call the DCI paradox. And let me show you what that is. This is the sequence of events that causes the abnormality in PCOS. So remember the epimerase enzyme. It turns out that in PCOS patients, there is a defect in the epimerase enzyme in the peripheral tissue. So they do not convert as much myoinositol into dechirioinositol. And so in the peripheral tissues, you have a reduced amount of dechiro, and the ratio is out of whack. So the reduced dechiro makes it difficult for the peripheral tissues to take glucose in, and you get hyperglycemia. That's the insulin resistance. And the hyperglycemia leads to increased insulin release, which we talked about, hyperinsulinemia. And now that circulating insulin, when it gets to the ovary, it stimulates the epimerase enzyme in the ovary. And so you get an overactive epimerase enzyme in the ovary, and it converts myoinositol to dechirioinositol at too great a rate. And so what happens then in the ovary is the amount of myoinositol is depressed, and the amount of dechirioinositol is increased because it's increasing the conversion to dechiro, that epimerase enzyme. And so that ratio gets out of whack. The dechirioinositol, if you remember, it increases testosterone secretion from the ovary. And the reduced myoinositol impairs FSH signaling, which leads to poor egg quality. And the increased testosterone and reduced FSH signaling together lead to anovulation. And so this is what we call the DCI paradox. What that means is in the peripheral tissues, in PCOS patients, there's too much myoinositol and not enough D-chiro. And in the ovary, it's exactly the opposite. There's not enough myo and there's too much D-chiro. And this is what leads to excess testosterone and reduced ovulation. So how can you use inositols, and what has been the record of clinical trial benefits by using them to correct this? So the first clinical trial that used inositols in PCOS women was done a little more than 20 years ago here in the United States at the Medical College of Virginia, and it was published in the New England Journal in 1999. There was a lot of excitement, and in fact, a company was formed that was going to try to make D-chiro inositol a drug. They were going to get a FDA approval for D-chiro to actually be a drug. And they then did a series of studies using higher and higher doses of D-chiro, and it turned out that it wasn't working well. And so the interest in the drug company and drug development here in the States kind of went away. And instead, Europe really picked up the ball and ran with it. And so subsequent trials over the last 20 years have all been done in Europe. And because there was some really bad results using pure D-chiro, the initial trials that were done in Europe used myoinositol alone, and more recently, a combination of myo and D-chiro together. Those initial trials focused on the metabolic benefits and restoring ovulation. And more recently, these trials have looked at the role of inositols in improving fertility outcomes, both in PCOS and non-PCOS patients. And now, finally, here in the States, the first trial that'll be done in the United States has been funded by the NIH, and it's getting underway at Penn State Medical School. So let's look at some of the clinical trial data. Metabolic endpoints. This was a study done in Europe, 2009, not controlled. 50 women with PCOS, they were treated with 4 grams of myoinositol per day for 6 months. They served as their own control group, basically. So compared to baseline at 6 months, they had a decrease in testosterone level of 30%, and their insulin resistance decreased by 50%, both statistically significant. 30% of the patients had complete disappearance of the excess body hair, hirsutism, and 53% of the patients had resolution of their acne. At roughly the same time, a controlled study was done with 42 women that had PCOS who were randomized to either 4 grams per day of myoinositol or placebo. They then looked at certain metabolic outcomes. Serum testosterone decreased 65% in the myoinositol group, basically unchanged in the placebo group. Triglycerides decreased by 51% in the myoinositol group, down by 11% in placebo group. And the area under the curve for plasma insulin was reduced by 35% for myoinositol and was roughly stable, unchanged in the placebo group. All of those were statistically significant. Finally, insulin sensitivity increased by 80% in the myoinositol group, and it actually decreased by 13% in the placebo group. So, if I mentioned before, what has been the standard go-to approach in the past for insulin sensitivity improvement, and that would be metformin. So how do inositols actually compare to metformin? There have now been a number of trials looking at this. So this study that was, again, done and published in Europe looked at 120 women with PCOS, chronic anovulation, and they were randomized to either 1,500 milligrams of metformin per day or 4 grams of myoinositol daily for 6 months. Metformin group had restored ovulation in 57% of the patients with a live birth rate of 17%. Myoinositol restored ovulation in roughly 70% and had about a 26% live birth rate. Now, if we compare those numbers to Clomid and letrozole, and Clomid and letrozole were compared to each other in a 2014 New England Journal study, what we see is that myo-inositol is really in the same ballpark in terms of efficacy. And certainly it's in the same ballpark in terms of live birth rate with letrozole. I should mention that letrozole and clomiphene, both of which are still widespread in use, have significant issues. Clomiphene is notorious for causing multiple gestation. So you end up with triplets or quadruplets sometimes. And letrozole has a black box warning because it does statistically increase the risk of birth defects, major birth defects. So neither of those drugs are entirely without their issues. This study that was published in 2017 randomized 60 subjects with PCOS to either 4 grams of myo or, again, 1,500 milligrams of metformin daily for 12 weeks, and serum testosterone, modified Ferriman-Galloway score. That's a score that's used to measure excess body hair. Was improved with myo-inositol. C-reactive protein, which is a measurement of inflammatory change in the body. All of those things were statistically much more improved with myo-inositol than they were with metformin. Finally, a meta-analysis of a number of randomized clinical trials comparing metformin and myo-inositol was published last year, a total of 355 patients, and myo-inositol was as effective or more effective than metformin in normalizing fasting insulin, insulin resistance, serum testosterone, sex hormone binding globulin, and BMI as well. The only significant difference was found that metformin subjects were 5 times more likely to experience significant side effects. If you've dealt with patients who are taking metformin, you'll know that it causes pretty significant GI side effects, and it's not well tolerated by many patients. So what about reproductive outcomes? Inositols have been studied extensively for their benefits during IVF treatment. And there was actually a meta-analysis published 3 years ago looking at 7 randomized trials with almost 940 PCOS subjects. The total amount of fertility injectable drug, the gonadotropin dose, was reduced by 14% with use of inositols. The number of grade 1 embryos was increased by 8%. The miscarriage rate was reduced by 66%. This is probably because of the benefits of inositols on egg quality. And the clinical pregnancy rate was increased by 21% in this meta-analysis. All of those were statistically significant. And now there are some studies that have been looking at, because of the impact of the inositols with FSH signaling, they are now studying it in IVF that's being done in non-PCOS women who are just poor responders. And so this is a study that was published looking at 72 poor responders that were undergoing IVF who were randomized to either 4 grams of myo or placebo for 3 months prior to their egg retrieval, their gonadotropin dose, the metaphase 2 oocytes, that means mature eggs, and their grade 1 embryos were all basically improved by the use of inositols. Finally, clinical pregnancy rate was improved by 17%, but it was not powered for that endpoint, and so that did not reach statistical significance. Most recently, instead of using myo-inositol alone, most of the clinical trials that have been done over the last 3-4 years have used a combination of myo-inositols and dichiro-inositol. And the reason they do the combination is because, as we said, there's this paradox. Peripheral tissues are deficient in dichiro-inositol, but the ovary has too much dichiro and is deficient as a result in myo-inositol, because it's the ratio between those 2 second messengers that's so important. The physiologic ratio, our normal physiologic ratio in our plasma of myo to dichiro, is roughly 40-1. And so most of the recent European studies have used myo plus dichiro in that 40-1 ratio as the intervention. This is a study that was published and looked at, that was one of the early studies to look at the combination. And basically it looked at the metabolic impact of using the combination of myo and dichiro compared to myo alone. And both all three endpoints, fasting insulin, insulin area under the curve, and fasting glucose, were all statistically more improved by using a combination of myo-inositol and low-dose D-chiro in that 40-to-1 ratio than using myo-inositol alone. So I mentioned earlier that finally, when we came out with our product, which I'll show you in a minute, which is called Inositol, it was the first 40-to-1 myo D-chiro product here in the United States. And as we would bring this into fertility practices around the country, we got a lot of really blank stares. And we jokingly started to call this NIH syndrome, meaning not invented here. All of these studies were coming from Europe. And so most of the REIs and IVF practices here in the States and in Canada had no knowledge of the inositols. And finally, over the last 3-4 years, the fertility world in North America has finally caught up. And the NIH has now agreed to fund a study. It's called INSUP PCOS, which means inositol supplementation for PCOS. And it is using the Androgen Excess Society inclusion criteria. It's underway at Penn State Hershey Medical School. Dr. Rick LeGros is the principal investigator. It's using Inositol, which is our product. I'll show you that in a minute, as the intervention. It's a 40-to-1 combination product, 40-to-1 ratio of myo-inositol and D-chiro-inositol. The goal of this initial study is to assess metabolic endpoints and confirm the optimal dosage for a follow-up multi-center fertility-focused study. When you do a study looking at pregnancy or live birth as the endpoint, you need a gigantic study population. You need to see a difference. You really need hundreds and hundreds of couples to get enrolled in that study. And so this is an initial pilot study that will then lead into a fertility-focused study down the road. This pilot study will look at metabolic endpoints and then lead on to the next phase of testing. So last section here, treatment considerations. It appears that supplementation with 4 grams per day of a 40-to-1 ratio of myo-inositol to D-chiro-inositol can restore the physiologic ratio in both peripheral tissues and the ovary. And if you do that, if you give the myo and D-chiro in combination, this will improve both metabolic and reproductive endpoints in most PCOS patients. Now, if you look at the study data, ovulation can be restored in as little as 3 months, but the resolution of androgenic issues, of the skin and hair issues, can take up to 6 months to see resolution. And most of the studies have now pretty much clearly shown you want to avoid using high-dose D-chiro-inositol alone, because it clearly does have an adverse impact on the ovary. Inositol supplementation is inexpensive, it's non-prescription, it's totally safe, and it's very well tolerated. And so this is our product, Inositol. We released this product about 5 years ago. It is a 40-to-1 myo to D-chiro blend. It serves as an insulin sensitizer, and it can restore ovulation and reduce serum testosterone. It is NSF content certified. NSF is a nonprofit agency which is based up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. It is one of 2 nonprofit independent supplement certification programs available here in the U.S. And our product is the only inositol product that is independently certified by either program. There are no additives or excipients. This is a pure inositol product. And it's being used, as I mentioned, in this NIH-funded study. The dose is 2 grams twice per day. And so it's a powder, and it's typically mixed with water. And it comes in either packets or a canister. And so typically it's taken 2 grams mixed with 8 ounces of water in the morning, and same thing in the evening. It is completely tasteless, odorless, and well tolerated. If you mix 2 grams with 8 ounces of water. The water has a slight sweetness to it. Again, it's sort of like in that same family as mannitol or sorbitol. It's a sugar alcohol, but it's pretty much almost tasteless completely. The cost of this is as low as $65 for a 90-day supply. Let's talk really quickly about safety and side effects, because there have been studies that have used up to 18 grams per day without any safety issues whatsoever. Although if you get above 4 grams per day, some patients will occasionally have some mild GI upset, maybe loose stools or flatulence. And its use during pregnancy, which is always a question that comes up, is not only safe, but in multiple studies, it has now been shown that the use of inositols during pregnancy significantly reduces the risk of gestational diabetes. So gestational diabetes affects up to 14% of all pregnancies, but PCOS increases the risk by 300%. Myo-inositol supplementation has been now used in 5 clinical trials looking at gestational diabetes. They've used women with PCOS. They've looked at women who had a first-degree relative with type 2 diabetes. They've looked at women who had elevated fasting blood sugar during their first trimester, women who were obese. And this meta-analysis that was published last year, almost 1,000 subjects in these 5 randomized trials, they found a 51% reduction in gestational diabetes through the use of inositol supplementation, highly significant, a 65% reduction in preterm delivery, with no adverse effects reported. So inositol supplementation is not only safe to continue during the pregnancy of a woman with PCOS, but it's probably a great thing to do. So key takeaways. Myo-inositol and D-chiroinositol play a key role in insulin receptor signaling. Low levels of myo-inositol in the ovary adversely impact ovarian function and egg quality. Elevated levels of D-chiroinositol in the ovary cause increased testosterone production. And if you supplement with a 40-to-1 ratio of myo to D-chiro, that is as effective as metformin in reducing insulin resistance and excess testosterone production, and will improve the metabolic endpoints in most PCOS patients. It will restore ovulation and improve fertility outcomes in both PCOS and non-PCOS patients. So I'm going to turn this over now to Ian. Kent, if you would unmute Ian's mic, and he's going to tell us, he'll tell you a little bit about the company and our provider programs that we have and about the product itself.
And we have some questions too, Mark, as well. So
okay, let Ian go through a couple of these slides real quick, and then I'm happy to stick around and answer as many questions as people have.
Thanks.
Hi, I'll be really brief. Thanks for joining us tonight, everyone. I think Mark covered the Inositol cost, $65 for the canister, $78 for the packet supply. Mark, you'll have to forward the slides for me, remember. We do have a lot of programs that we can help your practice with if you would like to work with Theralogix. We have wholesale programs, an affiliate program that does not require inventory. We offer the brochures and educational materials for you to use at your practice. And we also have a digital app for you folks that would like to be able to recommend products remotely or quickly for those tech-savvy patients. Using the brochures, we would assign you a PRC, which would be specific to your practice. And the patient comes to the website or an 800 number, and we drop ship straight to their home if you decide to do the referral. We have low minimums for wholesale orders, and the special that's offered here to the 31st for your first wholesale order is 15% off, and you can access that by connecting with us at the landing page at healthyseminars.com/Theralogix. As I mentioned, ship the product straight to the customer's home if you use the referral process, and we would welcome the opportunity to work with you all if you care to reach out to us.
Thank you very much, Ian from Theralogix. And again, thank you, Dr. Mark Ratner, for this presentation. Let's team stop the share and we'll get to some questions. So in order that I received them, Mark, I'm not sure if I missed it is what they're asking, but what is the effect of the enzyme that converts inositol into D-chiroinositol that causes the difference in ratio?
The epimerase enzyme. Okay, so an epimerase is, there are many different epimerase enzymes in the body and in nature. And an epimerase simply means that it's an enzyme that converts one isomer, one stereoisomer, into another stereoisomer. And in this particular case, the epimerase converts myoinositol into D-chiroinositol. And the work that was published probably about 4 years ago out of University of Virginia showed that the peripheral tissues in women with PCOS have a defective epimerase activity. And so as a result, those peripheral tissues, the ratio of myoinositol to D-chiroinositol is too high. It's too much myo and not enough D-chiro in the peripheral tissues. And that is what's leading to the difficulties with glucose uptake, hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, excess insulin in the blood. And it turns out that the epimerase enzyme, which is also present in the ovary, is not defective. And so the ovaries cannot be, it's been very clearly shown, ovaries do not become insulin resistant. Instead, the epimerase enzyme in the ovary responds to the excess insulin that's in the blood because of the peripheral insulin resistance by cranking too much D-chiro out. And so in the ovary, that epimerase gets overactive. If in the peripheral tissues, it's underactive. In the ovary, the epimerase is driven to overactivity. And so you get too much conversion of myo to D-chiro. And so in the ovary, you end up with too much D-chiro, not enough myo. The ratio is reversed. That's the paradox. And that's been pretty clearly shown in some pretty elegant work that was done at the University of Virginia and published about 3-4 years ago.
Thank you for that question. We're going to go on to the next one. I just want to remind people, because a few people asked for your handouts. If you go to healthyseminars.com/Theralogix, or you go to the resource page and go to July 7th and then click on this, it'll take you to this link. This is where the replay will be. And if you scroll down, there is a section from a message from Theralogix. Use this link, and this link will take you to Theralogix so you can ask for the handouts. You can also see they're offering a discount there if you forgot what they're asking. And the other two replays are also here, the one on micronutrients where he talked about several, my favorite, vitamin D, and the cannabinoid talk. These are all on the same Theralogix page, and we're still doing the live webinar here, but those that are watching this as a recording, this is where the replay will be, just to let you know. And you use that link to contact Theralogix. Dr. Ratner, can it be taken with a multivitamin since many of them have an inositol in it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Not a problem.
If the patient takes this, would they not then need to do metformin or other oral contraceptives prescribed by their gynecologist and fertility doctor? I will say before you answer this, because this is for educational purposes, you do need to talk to your gynecologist or fertility doctor. Dr. Ratner, though, what's your take on this question?
Let me also give the disclaimer that as a urologist who treated male fertility issues, I don't have direct experience using either metformin or inositols with patients. But I do have 5 years of conversations with fertility docs and OBGYNs around the country who have been using this product. And I can tell you anecdotally that it can easily take the place of metformin and oral contraceptives. But it does take 3 to 6 months to, unlike oral contraceptives where you're basically just throwing estrogen into the mix. or Clomid or letrozole, where you're basically in 30 days, you're just forcing that ovary to produce eggs and ovulate. This takes time. And again, it's probably 3 months on average to restore ovulation, up to 6 months for the androgenic side effects to respond. But this should be done this should not be done without discussing it, as you said, with either your fertility doc or your OBGYN. I would probably say if somebody's already on an oral contraceptive or metformin, you would probably add the inositols and then try to wean down on the metformin and possibly eliminate the oral contraceptives to see.
And you mentioned it's not because you do mostly urology, it wasn't your clinical experience, but you shared data that showed the metformin compared to the inositols was equal, or even the inositols doing better. So there is research, not
to support that. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Would this product be good for a woman who is a diabetic, but not PCOS, but wants to conceive? So somebody with blood sugar issues, a diabetic, would my inositol, D-Chiro, your product, be something that could support them?
Well, again, whether this is type 1 or type 2 diabetes would matter. A type 1 diabetic, we wouldn't expect this to have much benefit. But there are now several studies. I showed one, but there are several studies which show that inositols improve reproductive outcomes in non-PCOS patients as well. And the reason for that, most of those studies have been done in poor responders, women who have a low antral follicle count or AMH issues, and it improves their pregnancy rates. So I think I would say to that question, it certainly wouldn't be expected to necessarily impact the diabetes, either pro or con, but it certainly could help with fertility.
Did you share, or is there data on patients for improving outcomes? You were just talking about that. So non-PCOS patients.
Yeah. One of the studies that I showed, one of the last studies that I showed, was a study that looked at poor responders. In other words, they looked at women who had, I think their AMH had to be below, I forget, 1.5 or something like that, or a very low antral follicle count, and they randomized them to either inositols or placebo. And these were all women going through IVF, but statistically significant improvements in egg quality, embryo quality, and pregnancy rate with inositol use.
Another question, we'll get to this one here. What's with the
it's a great question. I can read it. It's a great question about thyroid. Yeah. Inositols, go ahead.
I have another one before that. So it's just a private message. What about digestive issues? Because metformin, there's digestive issues. But some people say on the inositols, they find that their stomach gets upset and gas. What's the mechanism behind that? And what do you recommend to reduce that upset? Because that's what one of the questions are.
I can't really speak to the mechanism. I think some of us have sort of just made the assumption that it has something to do with the ability to break down those sugars, kind of almost like a lactose intolerance would be an inability to break down lactose. So inositols or sugar alcohols. It's pretty unclear. It's a very small percentage of our patients, of our women that use this product, that discontinue it because of GI upset. I will say though, if we've got tens of thousands of women who are using this product, and if I had to say, what's the number one complaint that we get? It's probably GI, even though it's probably, well under 1 or 2%. It is still GI that's the most common. And it's like loose stools, gas. We've heard from a number of women, if you just kind of keep using it, it gets better. But for some women, it's just too much and they'll discontinue.
Gotcha. Okay. And then inositols also help with thyroid receptors. Would you know if the effect on the thyroid receptor is the same as the insulin receptors?
Yeah. So if you noticed in the NIH trial, one of the things that they're going to be looking at is thyroid hormone responses, and it is a second messenger. The inositols serve as second messengers not only for insulin and FSH, but also for TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. And so there's reason to think that it could have a benefit in patients who have low thyroid function. Yeah.
Perfect. Again, I want to thank you very much. I remind you guys, for our free series, you can go to our resource page. And if you're looking for this page, because I know some of you will go, where was it? If you can remember the date you watched it on July 7th, you can get to it from here. But again, if you just go to the Theralogix page on Healthy Seminars, there you can find all 3 webinars. The replays are there under Theralogix, that's GIX at the end. And that's also where you find the other 2, all 3 replays. And what I meant to say is the message from Theralogix, this link, please follow this link. That's what's going to take you to their website, and you can request directly from Theralogix the handouts from them. I want to thank you very much. I know a lot of people here are fellows of the ABRM, or Acupuncturist Fertility, that love this product with the Inositol, that combine it with their acupuncture to help women with PCOS and IVF. And so it's just a nice marriage to be working with your inositols and the acupuncture as well. And I know a lot of people here are using your product, so it's good to have some of the education behind it as well. Again, so thank you very much, Dr. Ratner. Thank you guys for your wonderful questions as well. Take care, everybody. Until next time.